So for this final panel, I am really delighted that we have such a continuing range of perspectives and experiences to draw upon as we ask this question about what would be some of the next steps toward a new accountability. We're going to hear first from my good friend Richard Carranza, who is the superintendent in the San Francisco Unified School District. We get into a lot of trouble together up and down the peninsula. Richard has established a really strong and exciting agenda in San Francisco to strengthen instruction and innovation around a very strong commitment actualized in a variety of important ways around social justice. He started public school initially as a young person speaking no English and has really understood the issues of equity and opportunity firsthand and has brought that and his multiple degrees since then to bear on solving these problems in a very important district in this country. He'll be followed by Mike Cohen, who's currently the president of Achieve, which is an education organization comprised of state governors and business leaders that focuses on raising academic standards, improving assessments, and strengthening accountability so that all students graduate ready for college, career, and citizenship. He has experiences both at the federal and state levels in very important ways that inform his thinking. He was Assistant Secretary for Elementary and Secondary Education in the Clinton administration. He also worked for the National Governors Association. I thought you were at the White House for a little while in there somewhere. And so he's been looking at these questions and working on them for a long time from multiple perspectives. Randi Weingarten, again, president of the American Federation of Teachers, and Randi will both bring her perspective from that work, which is involved in issues of economic opportunity as well as high-quality public education, healthcare, and public services for students, families, and their communities, a very broad view on what the work is, and also the experience of her teaching as a Brooklyn high school teacher. And then finally, Phillip Lovell, who is from the Alliance for Excellent Education. Phillip is the Vice President of Federal Advocacy at the Alliance. He's responsible for leading the organization's efforts on Capitol Hill to advocate for federal policy in support of the nation's high schools. Phillip has also spent time advocating for children and youth on Capitol Hill in other previous incarnations, dealing in areas of homelessness, youth development, and education. So he also brings that perspective to bear. And I'm going to ask Richard to start with a challenging task. And I know there's a slide that he may refer to that you may want to move to, if you can, in the slide deck. Good, there it is. So a lot of people have been asking, okay, we've got a lot of ideas out here about what it might look like to have an accountability strategy that is focused on meaningful learning, professional capacity building and accountability, resource accountability, and so on. And Richard is in a unique position as a member of the core consortium of districts in California. San Francisco, along with other districts, received an ESEA flexibility waiver from the U.S. Department of Education, which was pretty controversial at the time, the idea that districts would come together and ask for a waiver themselves. But they put together a very innovative approach to accountability. It fits in ways within the California system we heard about earlier, but it's moved along many trajectories and integrated them together. So I'm going to give you the opportunity to say, what does it look like in the core districts when you bring all of these pieces together? What is that approach?
Well, thank you, Linda, and thanks. I appreciate the opportunity to be here this afternoon. So what does a 21st century graduate really look like? What are the skills and dispositions? What do we want them to be able to know and do and demonstrate? What do we want them to be able to demonstrate in a work environment or an academic environment? That's really the genesis behind the work that 10 crazy superintendents in California got together and said, listen, we can't wait for the federal government to keep dawdling around ESEA reauthorization. We have real issues of disproportionality. We have real issues of accountability. We have real issues of lack of preparation and building of capacity for the educators in our system. So what we did is we said, what would it look like if we actually had an accountability system that started from not the point of accountability as the driver for school improvement, but we started with capacity building as the real driver for school improvement. So if we believe that teachers are far and above one of the greatest resources that can actually impact student learning, and instead of beating them down to death and saying you're failing your students, we say how do we provide capacity to identified work strands that will help us close the achievement gap, that will help us to increase student achievement, that will help us to decrease disproportionality. So it was really a very simple conversation, a very simple question that started our work together. And as a core consortium, we represent over 1.6 million students in California. So we figured, why not? Let's go for it. And the notion that, and I don't know about you, but I've never ever hired anybody by having them come in and sit down at a desk and fill in a bubble sheet and we take their test score and highest scoring person gets the job. No, right? So then why do we assess students that way? Right? We want students that can communicate. We want students that are actualized in their community. We want students that can present, that can work in teams, that have a little bit of knowledge not only about reading, writing, and arithmetic, but can also have knowledge about the humanities and social studies and can communicate in their community and be part of the empowering that we heard so much about as part of the local control funding formula. So what we said is that academic achievement has to be part of our accountability matrix. Absolutely. That's 60%. But also as important is all of the social-emotional aspects of student learning and climate and culture. So what does that look like? And if you look at the slide here, it's very basic, but 40% of our accountability system also takes into account those social-emotional learning indicators that we all know. Persistence, stick-to-itiveness, growth mindset. How do you, and one of the things that we're grappling with, because it's the pie is not baked, is you want to be able to measure, but you also want to be able to impact whatever you're measuring. So what are those social-emotional factors based on the research that we can actually measure, but we can also impact and we can also provide capacity for building? But very simply, and I'm going to say this right off the bat, my comments are very much as a practitioner. I'm a practicing superintendent with all that comes with that. So my biggest issue is that we are working within a system that has been historically set up to disadvantage certain students and advantage other students. And the system is working very well. So our fundamental premise is that we're not interested in systems improvement. That's the wrong paradigm. We're interested in system change. How do we change the system from an equity and social justice perspective so that we're empowering communities that have historically been disenfranchised? And in my particular case, if you are an African-American student in San Francisco, you are 8 times more likely to be identified as an emotionally disturbed student with special needs, rather than 10 times less likely to be in an AP class. So it's either the child's fault or it's the system not serving the needs of our students. So that's what drives everything here: elimination of disparity, disproportionality, but also trying to strike a balance of academic achievement and being accountable to academic achievement, but also being accountable to social-emotional learning. So the very simple question that Linda asked, what would this look like when fully realized? It's going to look like we have teachers that are well supported. Teachers that are going to be not only well compensated, but are going to have an exceptional professional development that goes to the needs of the students that they're working with every single day. You're going to have a system that is completely tuned to making sure that the students that leave the system are successful, whether they go into higher education or go into the workforce. And it's also going to mean that we have a system that is churning on all cylinders and reducing disproportionality, reducing the achievement gap, reducing the opportunity gap, so that we really do eliminate the opportunity and achievement gap. That's what nirvana will look like for us if this system is actuated. Now, there's a long road between here and nirvana, and hopefully no one dies along the road. But that's really the fundamental premise of what we're trying to do in California as part of this collaboration of school districts.
Can I just ask one follow-up question now, and then I'll come back around some other things later. But one of the features of the core accountability plan was, in some ways, I think perhaps borrowed from Shanghai and some other places, that have paired schools up with each other to allow struggling schools to learn from schools that have been more successful with similar populations of kids. And I wonder if you could say a little bit about that approach to capacity building, and what do you see as some of the most important outcomes and challenges of the capacity building efforts so far?
Sure. So I remember as a high school principal, when my school was considered a failing high school, and the state came in, right? Now, I don't know about anybody here, but as a high school principal, the minute they say, I'm from the State Department and I'm here to help you, run for the hills, right? So despite the best efforts, the state wasn't capacitated to help me turn around what was happening in my school. What we found as really effective was when we were able to collaborate with colleagues in schools that had similar demographics, that had similar challenges, but that were having success in areas that we weren't having success. That's where the real reform, if you will, took place. So we borrowed that notion from Shanghai. So what we've done amongst this coalition of schools, 10 different school systems in California, we've identified our school systems and tiered them in terms of schools that are not achieving well, some that are achieving a little better, and then some that are doing very well. And what we've done is across that entire system, we started matching higher performing schools with less well-performing schools that have similar demographics. And then we're actually taking, because we have a waiver, we're able to take our Title I funds that previously had to go for supplemental tutoring services. We're able to capture that resource and invest it right back into our teachers and our schools to provide them opportunities to come together, collaborate, work together. And I'll tell you, we've had the first year of our schools doing this. You never quite know what's going to happen, right? It's kind of the E-Harmony approach. Will they actually like each other? Will they actually want to come together? And I'll tell you, it's been, of all of the aspects of this accountability theory, it's been probably the most successful. Our teachers, our principals, our parents are absolutely engaged and want to work with those schools that they've been partnered with. And talk about true parent engagement. Actually, we're not really interested in parent engagement either. We're interested in parent empowerment. We want parents to be empowered to be activists for their children. And I'll tell you, there's nothing like a group of parents from a school that is having some challenges going to see a school community where parents have established really robust systems and parent centers, and parents are literacy coaches because they're getting support. That parent group is empowered beyond anything we could ever do. So that's been a really successful, I think, part of our accountability system.
I love that idea about parents being part of that networking. I mean, we've been hearing about this. Those of us who have conversations about international models for learning have seen this kind of networking approach in Ontario and Shanghai and other places. But the notion that then parents will learn how to be more empowered, create more pressure and support for schools is really powerful. So let me, we'll come back around to some of these ideas, but let me ask Mike Cohen, from another perspective, Achieve has been actively engaged in state and federal level reform, initially sponsored the Park Assessment Consortium, and you've got a number of vantage points from which to be looking at this question. In the process of implementing the new standards, what do you think is the greatest concern for the state governors and the business leaders that you are working with?
Thank you. Let me answer that by stepping back and setting just a bit of context. Because what Achieve has been working on for about a decade now right, is this whole idea of college and career readiness. We released a study in 2004, in 2005, a series of reports that basically made two fundamental points. One, with regard to mathematics and literacy, the skills that students need to succeed in post-secondary education and the skills that they need to succeed in careers that pay well and have advancement potential are essentially the same, right? Career ready doesn't mean less well prepared or less rigorous preparation than college ready. It does. And the second set of studies we released was to look at the tools that states use to set expectations for students, academic standards, course-taking requirements for graduation, assessments, particularly for states that required students to pass tests in order to graduate, and the accountability indicators that are used to hold the system accountable. And essentially what we found was an enormous gap between the knowledge and skills students needed to succeed and every tool in almost every state that was used to set expectations for them. So we challenged states to raise the expectations, right? Align standards with the demands of college and career, require students to take a curriculum that would deliver those standards, have some place in the assessment system, assessments that actually measure whether students had met those, and by the way, if they did, tell the higher ed folks that these kids are prepared to do college level work while they're still in high school, or tell the kids that they're not, and give them some time to get better prepared. And since the mission of the K-12 system increasingly clearly is to prepare all students for college and career, figure out indicators that would tell us whether our systems are meeting that goal or not. So that's the agenda that Achievers have been working on for more than a decade. The governors and business leaders who've been involved with us in various capacities since then fiercely support that agenda because they see that, right, from their separate perspectives as critical, right, for economic competitiveness, workforce development. They see the U.S. needing to graduate students who are college and career ready in order for our economic system to work. So that's what's driving us. In that context, what's worrying them now is they see more conflict and less progress, right, in the system than we need, and they are fervently pushing us to figure out ways to keep this agenda moving forward, to support high quality implementation, to keep the Common Core standards in particular on track, but where that doesn't happen, to make sure that states have other college and career ready standards, right? Their biggest concern is that this is falling off of track. In that context, just two or three other things real quickly. One is we've been pushed recently in particular to make sure that people understand that when we say college and career, we don't mean college or career, right? And just last week, we put out a report called Making Career Readiness Count that suggests a range of indicators that could be used to assess how well schools or school systems are doing in preparing students to be, preparing students for careers. This has to do with whether they're enrolled in effective CTE programs. It has to do with whether they're engaged in internships and other kind of workplace activities. It has to do with what courses they take and how well they perform on a range of assessments. But it is very much designed to make sure that we don't split college and career as though they are two separate tracks. So that is, for us, part of keeping this agenda on track, but also part of making sure that we are helping to focus the K-12 system on the outcomes that are most needed.
Let me just note that one of the themes that's run through a lot of the sessions today has been this idea that we've got to get multiple measures. We've got to get indicators in the system of things that we care about. We can't only be worried about scores on end of year tests into subject areas. And I think that's an example of that. It's one that you see reflected in the core accountability structure. It's one that in California a similar conversation is going on about how does career readiness also get, how do we figure out that kids are in good pathways that will, and demonstrating the right skills.
So this fits right in with that. Just so if you go to our website and look for the last report we put out on making career readiness count, you'll find it all highlighted in one page, a 12-cell table of the kind of indicators that we need. So it is all about multiple measures of attainment, of achievement, of post-secondary success. So a range of indicators that we need to use to tell whether we're on track or not.
Yeah, and I think that is a theme in this conversation about a new accountability. So I appreciate you kind of bringing that up and reinforcing it. I do want to ask you before we move on to Randi. You said some of your constituents are worried about how to keep the commitments that have been made on track, and they're worried about it. What would it take to keep the movement towards college and career-ready standards on track in your view?
How much time do we?
Yeah, we have I'll give you about 3 minutes for that answer.
Yes,
right?
okay. Well, so short answer then.
Yeah.
I mean, the first thing that I thought about when I said that, right, was the political pushback, particularly in red states, right, on the Common Core. And it's not just that we all love the Common Core, it's that the turmoil that gets created when you abruptly shift standards and then say to educators and others, we've been working on this for 3 years and we changed our minds. Hold still for a couple of years while we write some new standards and then we'll be fine again. That is clearly not moving forward. They're also concerned about the conflicts and tensions that are existing between some state officials and some of the teachers about educator evaluation. And I'm convinced of a couple of things. One is that we have to get this thing figured out, right? That it is important to evaluate educators in part on whether they're having an impact on student achievement. But that's not the only thing that we need to do. Evaluation needs to have many more dimensions than that. We need to get it right more than we need to get it quickly. And even then, I think, one of the things I've done in my career is be in the middle of two sides debating each other, and sometimes I think I can tell when they're talking past each other. I think we've got some...
Want the duck?
I haven't heard the story of the duck yet, but I look forward to hearing that. So that is no doubt another area of concern, and I think we will all fail at what we've respectively set out to do if we don't find a way to come together around those issues. And one of the things that Achieve has been noted for is trying to find a way to bring diverse perspectives and diverse sectors, parts of the education system together to have rational conversations about how to move forward. So we're eager to help.
It's a good segue to Randi, actually. Randi, over a year ago, you called for a moratorium on high stakes associated with standardized tests in order to give teachers time to learn to teach to the Common Core standards and adjust to the new assessments and so on. I guess it was just this morning that we read that the Gates Foundation has called for a 2-year moratorium, so they've doubled your ask. I wonder what you think are the most important supports for teachers to be able to do this work well, and how we find this thoughtful ground that Mike has been just talking about.
So let me, actually, as I speak, can you hear me?
Okay.
How about now?
Whoa.
How about now?
Okay.
This woke me up too. Can we put your slide up as we're speaking?
Can we put the core structure back up?
Is that possible?
Yep, there it is.
Okay. And the only reason I would do that is because
Let's see if it's just a question of volume. Keep talking while they adjust your volume.
why don't I do perfect, sir? See, this is creativity and ingenuity.
Yes.
If one doesn't work, something else will. And do you need my teacher voice instead? Testing.
Okay, we're
great.
good.
And the
Testing,
reason-
you said that?
I did. But, the great thing about this testing is it was low stakes. Because if we stumbled, we tried a whole lot of different things.
Nicely
And if
done.
we could do testing that way, that would be really good. So the reason we called for the moratorium last year, and we said, take a pause, and got a tremendous amount of pushback, like what was spoken about earlier today, of as I call it, the chest thumpers instead of the roller up your sleevers. I'm a roller up your sleever. I'm like, how are we going to do the work we need to do to help kids? And that's why I wanted to put the core accountability standards structure back up, because I think that is a way of kind of looking at things, and I think it's important in terms of what is the goal of accountability. So what we said was, wait a second, if these standards are really important, if they are, and let me say it this way, standards are important if they are aligned to, or if they're answering the question, do they help us get to what do kids need to know and be able to do to be prepared for, and I would actually add, life and citizenship with career and college. Because I think those are the four things that we as educators, if we actually sat there and said, what is it that we want? What are our aspirations for our children? And also, I'm saying our children. So what if those are so what is it that we want kids to do and be able to do to navigate their lives, to be prepared for life, citizenship, college, and career? And then you start saying, okay, the standards have some real resonance to this. It's not the be-all and the end-all. It doesn't do everything. It doesn't do everything that's on that list in terms of climate, social, emotional, all this stuff. It doesn't do everything in terms of relationship building. It doesn't do everything in terms of resilience. It may help, as Mr. Turnipseed said, it may help us figure out how to, all of us, do different ducks. But it doesn't help everything, but it's really important. Now, if that's true, that it's really important, then how are we going to borrow some of the phrases from people earlier today? How are we going to give both parents and teachers the time they need and the supports they need to actually let them roll up their sleeves and get to it? And so what was happening instead is that the testing conversation just started dominating everything. So the conversation became about conflating the testing of the standards with the teaching of the standards. And the moment that happened was the moment we could lose it. And that's why I said we have to link those two things, regardless of whether you like or dislike high-stakes testing, regardless of whether you think testing is the be-all and the end-all as an accountability system. If we're going to go through this transition to Common Core or to other standards, you have to delink the who's going to be blamed for something not working from the transition to making it work. And that was the point of saying the moratorium. And not to get to the second question, which is testing in and of itself the be-all and the end-all of how we show student learning? That's a separate question. This was, what do we need to do to actually make these things matter?
And can you say a little bit more about what you think it is we need to do?
Yes. I know, but that's why I really love the duck. And the reason I brought the duck up was not only the fact that I absolutely have to have my hands, for me to think, my hands need to be doing something all the time, because I am a very tactile learner. There are different kinds of learners, as Piaget and others told us. There are some who are auditory, right? Some who are tactile. There's some who are visual. There's some who are all the above. What we're asking teachers to do is to basically take take kids as we have them and as we love them, and to actually help them find their potential. And that's what we're asking teachers to do. So that's why it gets to the next question of, so what kind of accountability system do we need to actually get to the kind of outcomes that we want to see for public education for all kids, knowing that all kids are different? And so that's why I love the work that CORE has done and the work that Linda set out initially. Because right now in the United States of America, the way we define that is to say, did a child do well once a year on a standardized test? That's how we define it. And we define it narrowly in terms of English and mathematics tests. As opposed to taking the 3 steps of saying, what is it that we want kids to know and be able to do? Create and having some consensus around that. Then secondly, how do we help them get the teachers that they need to help them get that done? And how do we invest in those teachers the kind of lifelong learning that Mark Tucker talked about earlier? That's the whole issue of, so first issue was lots of different ways of looking at learning, and the second issue is lots of different ways of looking at professional capacity. But the third big bucket becomes, okay, you can't just throw teachers the keys and say, do it. What are the other supports and the resources and the other things that need to happen in order to put this whole system together? And that's why I think some of us call that resource accountability. Some of us talk about it in different ways, like a great neighborhood school that is collaborative and welcoming and safe. Some of us talk about it in terms of wraparound services so that we help kids with the emotional and social skills that they need and challenges that they have. But whichever way you look at it, it does actually come down to a triad of, if we want kids to have a range of outcomes that are going to help them be prepared for life, citizenship, career, and college, we need to make sure they have, really good teachers. And how do we help develop that capacity, and a whole bunch of other resources to do the stuff that Z told us about this morning that breaks the current trajectory of basically saying you are your demography or your geography. And the reason I wanted that slide up is that is a good example of how to do this. But the last thing I'll say is this: the only way we're going to change from test and punish to this kind of improve and support is if people actually agree in this room and in other places that these 3 buckets of things, plus all the kind of civic engagement and parent engagement we're talking about, are really the different kinds of levers that we need to help kids be prepared for life, citizenship, career, and college. If we don't get to a consensus on that, then the default position is still going to be double down on testing.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Sorry. I know, I'm throwing papers all over.
Philip, you're in the unenviable position of following Randi. And that was a very... you can...
Sure, thank you for the sharing.
The Alliance for Excellent Education has been working on it with a number of constituencies as well to figure out what the elements of this new accountability system might be and how we might get there. And I wonder what are the most important ideas that are emerging in those conversations that could leverage strong improvements in education. And maybe some of those are ones that connect to what we've been talking about thus far.
Excuse me, no, thank you very much, and I think that a lot of them do. As Mike said, I think that before we sort of dive into some of the details of what the accountability system should look like, a bit of context could be helpful. And so I'll just share a few thoughts from the perspective of the Alliance for Excellent Education. And that is that, why do we need to get this right, and why do we need to get this right now? When the Elementary and Secondary Education Act was passed in 1965, it was passed as a piece of civil rights legislation, and rightfully so. Now, arguably, conversation today is in many ways limiting the federal role in that civil rights space, and that's, I think, a real problem, but it's important for us to acknowledge from where we came, and that is that the federal role in education is that of a civil rights perspective. Fast forward to now, not only do we have the equity imperative, but we have the economic imperative. The percentage of jobs that require at least some post-secondary education has doubled in the last 40 years. Over the next few years, the percentage of jobs that will require post-secondary education it'll be 2/3 of all jobs. And projections show that we're going to be about 3 million jobs short. In fact, if you look at the Bureau of Labor Statistics data today, you'll see that there are about 4 million jobs that are available. Why are they available? Well, other data show that it's largely because the people who are applying for these jobs don't have the skills that they need to fill them. So we have this combination of an equity imperative and the economic imperative that if we don't solve this problem now, today's kids are not going to be prepared to maintain America's competitive edge in the global economy. So if the Bible wasn't good enough of a reason, as my boss, Governor Wise, says, the billfold ought to be. Now with the accountability system, we've tried over the last several years, couple decades, a number of different things. And I think that many of us, perhaps all of us in the room, can at least agree on one thing, and that is that we haven't gotten it all right. I don't know that we're going to get it all right ever to everyone's satisfaction, but the Alliance has had the opportunity and the pleasure to work with a number of organizations to try to outline what some key principles of an accountability system could and should include, and they really incorporate a number of the concepts that have been discussed today. First, as Mike alluded to, really focused on, the goal here is college and career readiness. And we specify that as part of college and career readiness, we also mean that kids need to have what some of us refer to as the deeper learning competencies. So the idea that kids need to be able to apply what they know to be able to solve problems. They need to be able to think creatively. They need to be able to communicate effectively. And we're making progress on this in the policy sphere. It's important to know that a number of state waiver applications, state waiver plans, incorporate these ideas. And if you look to the Senate's bill proposing to reauthorize the ESEA, maybe I need to have a teacher voice. Their bill that they passed last summer, they actually changed the purpose of Title I to incorporate these deeper learning competencies. So we're making some progress on the policy front. One of the things that NCLB intended to do, I firmly believe that the authors of NCLB intended for this to happen, but it did not turn out this way in practice, is for the accountability system to focus, to have a strong emphasis on school improvement. I don't speak sign language.
The microphone.
We have to use microphone.
Here.
We're-
I think they want this mic to go to you.
Excellent. So now you have shared with me about giving your microphone, and for which I'm forever appreciative.
That's the collaboration we need.
That's what we're
Yes.
talking about.
Excellent. Okay. So, well, the accountability system.
Speak it directly into it.
And I need to turn it on.
Yeah, that too.
It's a higher order skill.
These are the college and career ready skills
Absolutely.
that we need to have. Thank you much. That was great. So the system needs to be much more focused on continuous improvement, on improvement in general. And the current, I shouldn't say the current system, but the system under NCLB, we all know if targets weren't being met, then you were sent into this somewhat of a labyrinth of improvement activities that neither research nor practice overall showed was going to be very effective, but that was the law of the land, and so that's what was going on. Our accountability principles first focus on this idea that before we can solve a problem, we have to understand it. And so we need to have a deep diagnostic assessment of what's actually going on in the life of the child and the happenings of the school in order for us to actually address it. And we need to have interventions that are specifically designed to address those needs. And if those don't work, then we need to refine what we're doing based on data. It's this process of continuous improvement. And that term, I think, means something to some people, and it means something very different to other folks. So I'm hesitant to use the term because for some it can be construed as or viewed as just getting away from accountability, and that's not the intention. The idea here is that you're actually using data to constantly refine what you're doing so that at the end of the day, our kids are graduating, ready for college and career and life and citizenship. So another indicator that's another segment of these policy principles for accountability, as has been alluded to, certainly is the notion of multiple measures. And again, states under the Department of Education's flexibility policy are really moving in this direction already. A number of states are incorporating things like AP, IB, SAT, ACT, the acquisition of industry-based credentials into their accountability systems right now. So the accountability systems of today are very different from the accountability systems before the ESEA flexibility policy, before waivers. What's interesting, and the Alliance will be coming out with a paper that reviews the accountability indicators within the waiver plans. What's interesting is that what I would argue is the most important indicator of college and career readiness is the least likely indicator to be included in state plans currently. And that is simply how many kids are actually going on to college and persisting. I think that's an area of growth for us. A couple other areas that I'll reference, and then I'll hand the mic over. One is certainly the issue of resource equity, that right now there really isn't an accountability system around resource equity. We had the previous panel, I think, discussed this very thoroughly, so I'll just leave it at that. I think that there's a very solid foundation in the room for what that means. And then lastly, the notion of transparency. Here is an area where I think in many ways we've headed into dangerous territory with the state waiver plans. NCLB, certainly a pinnacle of this was the notion of data reporting, and which was arguably very complicated in some aspects. Under waivers, a number of states are using systems like an A to F system, or a star system, or an index system. And in some ways, this was intended to make things more transparent. If your school's an A school, then you know it's doing well. If a school's a D or an F school, you know it's not so much. But what an A means varies tremendously from what one might think that an A means. In one state, which shall remain nameless,
Oh, go ahead.
they have, if you've read your waiver applications, then you'll know which state I'm talking about.
Oh, great.
They have a star system. And the system is designed such that 3/4 of schools have 3 stars or above. This state also has among the lowest graduation rates of any state in the country. I have narrowed down the possible pool of states.
There'll be a contest if you can figure it out.
It defies logic to think that truly 3/4 of the schools are 3 stars or above. So the system needs to be transparent, and everything within the system needs to be actionable. Those are a couple of the principles that we've discussed.
Very helpful, very helpful. I want to pursue, let me give people an opportunity if they want to address each other before I ask one more question, and then I'm going to turn to the audience. Is there anything that anybody wanted to pursue? Go ahead, Randi.
I just want to, the one thing I didn't say is that we,
Would you like your duck?
no, you can have the duck until we finish. And then I'm taking that duck wherever I go. Because that duck reminds me of Lacey's story. And that's why I'm taking that duck with me. Lacey's story about how, about the story that Stephen told at the very beginning of this, of this conclave. It may be that I feel the urgency of this race, of how do we get things done? And how do we move from test and punish to a different accountability system, so that we have actually, we at the AFT have actually spent the last year thinking about what to do to replace the current accountability system. And a lot of our work is very parallel to a lot of Linda's work and to a lot of the work that people have been talking about here. And some of that work we've done together. And so we actually are going to our convention this year with a new accountability paradigm that is very much premised on the three buckets that people were talking about today. And I think that that's part of this, how do we move to the next phase? And last thing I'll say is that if you think about what has been said from this stage all day, there is tremendous concurrence and resonance in a lot of what's being pushed. And so I feel really good about what we're going to bring to our convention, because it's very much a lot of what's been spelled out here.
So let me pursue this one more question, and then we're going to turn to the audience for questions about what might the assessment component of this new accountability system look like. And we've talked about the fact that we need measures that are more robust in some ways than what we've had in the past. We have two consortia, Park and Smarter Balanced, are developing new assessments, and I want to recognize if Joe Wilhoft is still here. Are you still here, Joe? If so, raise your hand. It's such a big room I can't see. There he is, way in the back. That there's a lot of work that has gone into both of those consortia efforts to broaden the kinds of assessments that might be used. But we are also talking about things that can't be captured in those assessments. Right. The kinds of work that the Urban Academy is doing, the kinds of assessments that kids could engage with in New Hampshire in a performance assessment system. And back in the 90s, under an earlier iteration of ESEA, the IASA, many states had a blended system of performance assessments and sit-down tests, and they organized them, in a more variable way in terms of what got done when, by whom, and so on, so that kids were being encouraged to learn all of the standards, and teachers were getting feedback and information about all those things. So I want to start with Mike on this question, but open it up to everyone. Partly because, Mike, you had a role in the IASA. You've thought about the federal and the state role in these assessment questions a lot. Some years ago, Achieve said in one of its publications, states will need to move beyond large-scale assessments because, as critical as they are, they can't measure everything that matters. The ability to make effective oral arguments, conduct significant research projects are considered essential skills by both employers and post-secondary educators, but these skills are difficult to assess on a paper and pencil test. How might we build systems, we're kind of returning to the conversation we started this morning, that really allow us to get assessments that are more informative and supportive of children's learning and teachers' capacity to help them?
So thank you. When we wrote that, right, I want to underscore we said difficult to do in large-scale assessments. I think that is still true, and so what that tells me is, for starters,
you have to send the duck also, I think.
no,
I believe it's roasted.
I can only hold one thing at a time. Does this work, by the way? Hard to tell from up here.
Yeah.
Okay. I think when it comes to research projects, when it comes to other kinds of performance tasks, I think what we're going to need to do is start to build those from the ground up. And there's no reason in the world why they can't be incorporated into local assessment systems and local accountability systems. In fact, I would argue better that way than to try to do it on an entire statewide basis all at once. Because I think we have a lot to learn how to do that, and even more to learn about how to do that at scale. And the more you push it to a larger scale, the more questions of the reliability of the scoring, the comparability of the scoring, all those things that you worry about are going to come to the fore sooner than I suspect we'd be prepared to do it. So I would look for districts to take on challenges like that, working on their own or with others. I would look for foundations to fund those kinds of activities. And I'd look also, right, to begin to see how can we take work that has already gone on in some places. How can we, for example, Common Core would have the advantage because you can then collaborate across states easily, but can we create some anchor instructional tasks or model instructional units that would have deep learning tasks built into them? Right? Try them out, learn how we can score those papers or products or whatever across schools, across classrooms, maybe across districts and ultimately across states, but can we create some anchor tasks, right, that really reflect the kind of instruction that's needed, use them as first of all, as instructional tools, secondly, as professional development tools, and thirdly, right, to begin to learn how to get better measures of the things that aren't going to be developed on a typical large-scale assessment. And the more we learn from that, the easier it can be to take that to scale in a variety of ways. Now, there's a lot to be done in order to make this work. You've got to get the instructional units and the instructional tasks well aligned to the standards. You have to have ways of evaluating the work. You've got to have ways of training people to do that within and across education systems. So there's a lot to be done there, but I think if we started at the bottom and worked our way up with that, we'd be in a very different place than we've historically been.
One thing I'll piggyback on that you just mentioned is that there are a set of states, 10 of them have been involved in something called the Innovation Lab States that the Council for Chief State School Officers supports, where they're building a common a bank of assessment tasks that can be used, drawn upon by teachers or schools or whatever, but have been vetted and validated, et cetera. New Hampshire is part of that work. You heard from Paul Leather this morning. The New York Performance Standards Consortium is also part of that work and doing work in Kentucky. So there is a nascent effort beginning. And I think part of the question is, how do you make room for that in the accountability structure so that it matters in ways that are productive and informative, not punitive, but are real?
So I'm glad you raised that. We are, first of all, among the strands of work that we're doing at Achieve is working with almost the identical network of states, is maybe a few that overlap there, who are interested from this perspective in figuring out how to shift from a time-based to a competency-based system. This has been the rhetoric of the standards movement for 30 years, except we've never really moved from it. I think we're in a position where we can actually make some progress on that, but it does require figuring out how to create performance assessments that can ultimately, right, have some reliability on a large scale, validity and reliability on a large scale. It does require figuring out what are the school and district level accountability questions that we want to ask and answer in a competency-based system. It cannot be what percentage of your fourth graders are proficient at the end of the year, because you don't care about that. What you care about is how individual students are making progress. It's a different kind of set of questions that will require a different set of metrics. So we are working at that. States are in the very early stages of taking those issues on, but I think, A, we want to be part of helping that, and B, if that doesn't happen, we will be stuck with the time-based system that we've got.
Yeah, and we also, I mean, the other challenge will be preserving the local management involvement that teachers are engaged in that really allows that to be helpful to kids and doesn't, cause it to become yet another outside. We need inside out and outside in assessments that somehow blend with each other to support children in their learning. Just because we were advertising other things earlier, I'll just mention that we have a book coming out called Beyond the Bubble Test this month, and it will also be, there'll be a link on the website where you can see what we've learned about performance assessments. I want to give folks in the audience an opportunity to ask some questions. So if there's anyone who wants to get to the mic, we've got time.
Can I just make one
Yep,
quick response?
you can make one more quick.
So one.
Oh, we took your mic.
You all are stuck. Yes.
Okay, good.
Here, use this. So
We'll send you a doc.
One cautionary note I want to raise, both from our work on the competency-based issues, but also as we think about, Randy, some of the things you talked about in terms of educating kids to their own potential and move where they want to go. We have standards for a reason, and that is to set a consistent and high floor of expectations so that what students are taught and what they learn is not a function of demographics or geography. So that has been an important part of the standards movement, and I think we've got to make sure we hold on to that.
And let me just say, I agree with that part of the standards movement. I'm very much in support of the standards movement, but what I'm saying, and I heard it in this audience here today, is that not every child moves in the same way, in the same direction. And what we have to actually do is create a lot of different supports, because what's happened with test-based accountability is that there's a presumption that the test is fixed and that whatever happens on the test is then the consequence, that becomes the education of a child. And that if we don't actually go back to the question that Linda just raised as people are getting to the mics, what do we need the role of assessments to do and what do they look like? And is there a way of having attainment on standards to look and feel very, very different and still be able to have a picture through the United States?
Well, yeah, I mean, we could go on and on about this because the other thing is we want every kid to find a future and find a place that their potential gets realized. So there's this delicate balance that has to be struck between allowing every kid to be successful and find their path to success and the drive we enact when we have norm reference testing that that ranks and sorts people against each other. So there's a lot to work out there. And we have a huge line, and we have about 13 minutes. So the lady right here with the blonde hair, yes, you were first.
Okay, we have this all set. We solved the problem.
Okay, all right. So what I'm going to
roll-uppers.
encourage us to do is take a few questions at once. Ask a quick question. Please don't make a long statement. We don't have very much time. And then let the panel, figure out how to answer those. Okay.
I'll keep it short.
Yes.
Danette Brown, California Teachers Association. Love everything that was said. With regard to assessment in general, and with reference, I think one of the unintended consequences of previous years of testing was that we, as a practitioner, would get a test score. And that number, or whether it was basic, proficient, would stay with that student for the year. And students, as a parent of 2 teenage girls, that label would stay with that child for the entire year. And it became sort of a stigma if they were in the lower portion of it. And I'm wondering, as we move, I heard great words like multiple measures, new ways of assessment, new paradigms of thinking about it. So what are your thoughts as far as moving into these new ways of having local benchmarks or different ways of thinking about it? What will that look like as far as the information we get? Is it going to be a number? What ways are we going to be able to interpret that data, and how will it reflect on what it tells us about the child?
That's a great question. We'll take one more and then we'll...
Donna Chair, President, AFT New Jersey. I hear a lot about time, and we all talk about how much time we do the state assessment, and then there's the benchmark assessments, and schools put on their assessments. But my concern about this whole assessment is that it's developmentally appropriate. I don't care if we do one assessment a year. To have young children who are learning in cooperative learning groups now sit at a desk by themselves for 3 to 4 days from anywhere from 37 to 78 minutes at a testing system. And I taught special ed, and we got to extend that. Extending that didn't help. So when we look at assessments, we not only need to look at what we're assessing, is it aligned, but we now need to look at students and their ages and give them appropriate assessments that are developmentally appropriate for them. And I hope to hear how we're going to do that.
Can I thank you? I'd like to take the prerogative of the chair to address those 2 questions first and then let others do so. There's a document out on the table if there's still any left, and if not, you can go to the website and pull one down, talking about how do we develop a system of assessments. And the word assessment means to sit beside. It comes from the root word s'asseoir, to sit beside, not to bubble in. The images we have of assessment now are kids hunched over a table bubbling in. But really, assessment is about teachers looking and sitting beside kids and seeing what they can do and learning and documenting that in a variety of ways. It's about kids doing things and demonstrating their learning in those ways. It is about sometimes responding to questions in a sit-down fashion on a test, but it should be all of those things, and we should be aiming to develop a profile of students, and we should pay attention to the learning progressions in the Common Core standards and how kids are moving along in their learning with multiple measures. In the British system, they had something called tests and tasks that teachers could use to look at kids and figure out where they were in these progressions over time in this kind of multiple measures fashion that then allows you to teach to the child, allows the child to learn about their own learning, gives people rich information, not just a score, but as evidence of work of various kinds to move people along. So we've got to get into this notion that a system of assessments is important for the individual child and their own ability to manage their learning and to know how they learn and what they're learning and how to help be an agent in their learning, as well as the teacher, and get away from the idea that there's a single score that labels the child and is the goal of the testing system.
I would only add to that as part of the CORE collaborative in California, we have thousands of our teachers from across our school districts that are sitting together and actually rolling up their sleeves, to Randy's point, and trying to figure that out. So what will it look like? What does it look like when it's really realistic? But I'm really bothered by the whole term assessment because we've defaulted that term to be summative assessments, the sitting down and taking a test. And we all know that assessments are much more robust than that. Teachers assess all day long to meet the needs of kids. But I do think also that the political environment in which we are operating our schools, let's just be real. People keep saying, we're not going to throw money at it. The answer is not money. Well, listen, this is my 25th year in education. I wish one year we would have thrown money at the issue. We've never funded education. So when you have a teacher in a classroom with 40 children, how can they meet the needs of each one of those children? So then it goes to class size. And how do you fund a system to provide the opportunity for professionals to really do their professional work? And the last thing I'll say about that, I want Dominic this, but the last thing I'll say about this is quiero que todo mundo aquí presente saque un lápiz, por favor, y que me apunten 3 cosas que han escuchado que son importantes. Now, why did I do that? Not to be disrespectful. For all of you Spanish language learners, you just failed my assessment.
That's right.
So we have to keep at the forefront the special populations, the children that have needs like our English language learner students. And that gets often whitewashed when we talk about assessment.
If I can add something to that, the discussion that we had, especially around the performance assessments, I think that we have a communications issue. Because there's the perception that a performance assessment is less rigorous than our current assessments. And nothing could be furthest from the truth. Rand did a study of current state assessments and found that less than, I think, 3% of the assessments in math actually measured higher order thinking, and for English language, for English, it was just slightly above that. I'm one who spent a lot of time on Capitol Hill, and I think that we have to provide very concrete examples of the difference between a performance assessment and a traditional assessment, while being very cognizant of what Mike was describing as the need for, before we take these things at national scale, to make sure that they're valid, reliable, because what we don't want is for the kids who have traditionally been underserved to be continually underserved because their instructors, because their teachers, haven't received the same level of professional development to actually design and implement these types of performance tasks. You don't want your low-income kids coloring pictures while your upper-income kids are designing these robust projects. Yeah. And so I think that we have to keep the civil rights perspective, the basis of the federal education policy, front and center in our minds as we talk about the implementation of these more robust assessments.
I think those of us who heard Gemma this morning describe her math project for her portfolio, and she had to calculate using trigonometry the distance from her school to the Empire State Building, would agree that it's a more rigorous assessment. A lot of countries have figured out how to do this.
That's where I wanted to
We've documented how they do it. We need to begin to learn from others who are further ahead. And by the way, A number of states did a very good job of performance assessment. Kentucky would be a leader in terms of creating a reliable system. Their writing portfolios were scored at 99% reliability at the end of that process. But we do know a lot. We've got to access it and use it.
So
Randi,
I
and
just-
then we're going to go back to
So I think where you just got to, Linda, is, and I'm just going to put it out there, and it's going to be very controversial to say, if we start thinking about what are accurate and reliable indicators of student outcomes, and not just presume that the one high-stakes test score is it, but we start thinking about other kinds of ways to substitute for the one high-stakes test score, because this is what shocks me. Every other country within the OECD has figured this particular piece out. None of them test every single child every year.
Right.
And yet, they all, on PISA and other ways, they are all being compared to us. And so if we don't actually give people the opportunity to think about what other ways constitute reliable and accurate measures of student learning, we're never going to get there.